Like many great stories, Heart of Darkness doesn't sit too easily into any one genre. Arguably, it's a simple adventure story, but if it is, it's a rather slow-paced one. Perhaps it's better to call it a psychological thriller. After all, it does explore the psyche of a madman, but it does that from several steps back in the form of an almost double frame narrative. So the best characterization is simply literary fiction, which is a posh way of saying that's a story that concentrates more on character development and psychological advancement than on action and plot. The constant references to white and black in this book are obvious and stark. Everything from the title onwards sets you up to view this novel as a battle between the forces of dark and light. Ivory and night, white-capped women knitting with black wool. Belgium is the whitened sepulchre, the Congo is the black jungle. It's important to note that neither of those are particularly positive images, and to step away, if you can, from the idea that white represents good and black represents evil. This is not the conclusion of Conrad, or of Marlowe himself, who mentions fairly early on in his musings that he considers white men and black men to be potentially the same. Actually, it's more true that colour is simply polarised. And in my interpretation at least, white seems to represent the forces of greed and corruption. It is darkness that hides the truth, even if that truth is the truth of the evil buried in our own souls. That's not to say that there isn't a certain amount of latent racism in the book, with the natives being represented as closer to children than as civilised, intelligent beings, but that childlike quality is portrayed as a good thing, and their qualities are those of innocence and of purity, rather than westernised sloth, lust for power, pride and greed. Heart of Darkness is set in what became known as the Scramble for Africa, a desperate attempt to divide the countries up and share them amongst the colonial powers, who weren't above using some fairly brutal violence in order to do that. Belgium comes off particularly badly here, in its total preparedness to enact a programme of violent dehumanisation in order to attain the country's substantial ivory reserves. If you find the book hard to get through, you're not alone. In fact, it's been hypothesised that Conrad made the book deliberately difficult to read, to reinforce the psychological impression of fighting your way through the jungle. Whether or not that's true, I don't know, but it's certainly a reassuring thought. Marlowe is an impressively grey character, in many ways a personification of ambiguity. Several critics have stated that it is this ambiguity that is the only reason Heart of Darkness is famous, because it works so well as a scholastic text. I.e., it is so open to interpretation that it is a perfect tool to teach literary analysis, but that fact doesn't in any way make it a great novel. Personally, that strikes me as a rather unfair critique, especially since open to interpretation is something you could equally level at Shakespeare or the Bible. Instead, I think that the ability to create a character that fades into the background, despite the great scale of adventure and circumstance that befall him, takes a kind of genius. For here Conrad does something fairly unique. He creates a likeable person that drifts through the narrative, creating exposition where required. Character as frame narrative. Of course, this book is really about Kurtz. It is Kurtz's story. Efficient and proper agent as he seems to the head office, taskmaster to the men on the ground, semi-tyrant and demi-god. Kurtz is a man whose shadow creeps into every aspect of the novel, even though it takes a long time for us to meet him, and we only do for a short amount of the book itself. Kurtz is clearly completely psychologically unbalanced by the time Marlowe reaches him. As Marlowe himself says, although his intelligence was clear, so too was his madness. In many ways, his life is a complete lie. The opinion that his country, his company, and his fiancée have of him do not reflect his actions in the jungle. There's even a lie in the name. Kurtz is German for short, but he's described by Marlowe as over 7 feet tall, suggesting a little Conradian in-joke about the discrepancy between the way we project ourselves and the way the world perceives us. Kurtz represents a total preparedness to abandon westernised ideals in favour of power. Whether you see that as a dated and racist attack on the perceived hypnotism of uncivilised Africa, as notable critic and author Chinua Achebe did, or as the fight for light and dark within our souls, or as the personification of the true evil of imperialistic empire building, is up to you. For me, Kurtz represents the triumph of morality over lust, the proof that it isn't possible to turn to the dark side without consequences for your soul. It sounds pretty trite, but in this instance the jungle really is the third character in Heart of Darkness, exerting a force of personality over the tone of the novel arguably greater than either of the other two protagonists, and certainly more compelling than Marlowe. Indeed, in some passages, particularly those referring to Kurtz, Conrad literally anthropomorphizes the jungle, with sentences such as, "The wilderness had patted him on the head, caressed him, loved him, embraced him, seeped into his veins and his flesh." And many of the African characters are extensions of the jungle rather than personalities in their own right, with the vision scene from the river and Kurtz's mistress particularly notable in projecting this theme.
The ending to Heart of Darkness is almost a narrative fade to black, a frustratingly ambiguous trail off that leaves you distinctly unsatisfied. We are left with the vague sense that Marlowe's life has been blighted by what he's seen in the Congo, without knowing the permanent effects of it. Whether Marlowe's experiences have made him resolve to be a good man, or imbued him with a fatalistic determination to be a bad one, is unknown. Of course, Conrad probably did this on purpose. Frustrating though this is, if you see the theme of the book as being the struggle between good versus evil, then it's actually quite a fitting conclusion. The point is almost that there is no conclusion, that ordeal will go on forever, that we live in an eternal battle between our conscience and our desires. We are left with the sense that Conrad doesn't see humanity as either light or dark, but instead an ambiguous blending into grey.